Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 467th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Summer is upon us here in Phoenix, and it's hot. With more people getting skin cancer these days, I'm not willing to take chances with the sun anymore. Before I introduce today's podcast guest, I want to share with you how I stay cool and comfortable working in the summer heat. My number one strategy is wearing lightweight, breezy, sun-protective clothing, like cool, moisture-wicking shirts and hats that shade my head, ears, and the back of my neck. I've partnered with Gemplers.com to handpick my personal favorite sun protective wear, and you can see them at Gemplers.com/urban farm. That's Gemplers, GEMPLERS.com/urban farm. When you use the code UrbanFarm01, you get 20% off your first order. Heidi and I use these essential items on this list every day on the Urban Farm. Check them out and stay cool this summer. Today on our podcast, we have someone who has way too much fun with worms. We're talking with Bentley Christie about worm composting. Bentley, also known as Compost Guy, earned an Honors Bachelor of Science in Biology with undergrad and grad studies in plant pathology, microbiology, soil, and compost science. He's been working with worms for over 20 years and has an interesting story on how that started, is the author of the blog Red Worm Composting, and is currently teaching about trench vermicomposting. What is that? Welcome to the show today, Bentley. Are you ready to rock worms?
Oh, I sure am. Thank you, Greg.
So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Absolutely. Geez, I hate to say it, but more than 20 years ago, I was working at a consulting firm, environmental consulting firm, and I was identifying aquatic invertebrates, if that means anything. But at the time, I heard that a coworker of mine had this crazy bin under her desk. It was like this blue recycling bin, just kind of sat there. She would open it up, she would toss her lunch scraps into it, and these worms were apparently taking those lunch scraps and converting them into this compost. So, I've been a lifelong nature nut, and this just completely fascinated me. The idea that this was going on in my workplace.
Right.
So I asked her, can I please take a look at this thing? And of course, she was very nice about it. And she opened this thing up, and it's funny thinking, all this time later, I look back in memory and I think, she was not taking good care of that bin. It was basically like this bin of dirt, and I remember clearly this apple core with this collection of redworms just congregated all around. These poor little tiny redworms, they were just, hanging on for dear life. And it blew my mind. This idea that these little worms were taking what most people think of as garbage and converting it into this amazing looking rich soil. That was it. I was game over. And she saw how excited I was. She I was probably shaking at the time, and I couldn't believe it. And she insisted. She said, "You're taking a bucket of this stuff home." She sent me home with this worm-rich material, and it's been all downhill ever since.
Wow.
I started
Or uphill maybe, huh?
Yeah.
There you go.
But a little bit of both. But I started up my first bin probably within, maybe even later that day or whenever I had the chance to get over to pick up a plastic bin, and I almost killed them probably within the first week. But I haven't stopped since.
Nice. They actually call worm poop gardener's gold. What's so special about it?
Well, that's a good question. It's definitely very different from your average compost. Average compost it's much easier to produce in a sense. One of the things that, one of the reasons I promote worm composting so much is that it can be done on such a small scale. You can take a little tiny bin versus these big hot compost piles where you need, a cubic yard or a couple cubic yards. And then you produce this this concentrated black stuff. But yeah, there's been quite a bit of scientific research into what it is exactly. The process of taking these wastes through the earthworm digestive system seems, there's unique bacteria, there's unique things going on, and the end product has these compounds that the plant growth promoting compounds, and very little is actually needed. You only need a tiny little bit in the bottom of your pot or in the bottom of your planting hole. And there's definitely something different about it than your average compost. It's not a bulk thing. It's more of a small, specialized thing.
Yeah. And, it's got microbes in it. It's got nutrients in it. Have you ever analyzed the makeup of it to understand that better?
Not I myself. I've done a lot of reading just based on, it's amazing to me is that just the amount of academic research that there is. There's all these funny folk fertilizers and everything else out there, and I don't want to say hype, but there's a lot of stuff out there when it comes to natural fertilizers. But the body of academic research supporting worm castings is pretty mind-boggling. So, they've tested it in greenhouses, they've tested it in field trials, everything else, and it just consistently shows that not that much is needed. There's something in it that goes beyond what is just sort of the requirement of plants. So you can fertilize them with your typical fertilizers. If you add the worm castings, invariably, it's going to boost plant growth, no matter what. It's a different type of material than your typical compost.
So it really, truly is gardener's gold.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not biased.
Yeah, there you go. What is vermicomposting?
Well, vermicomposting is basically the same thing as worm composting, of course, which, the obvious answer would be composting with worms. Now, the one big problem there is that when you say that, a lot of people assume that, okay, I can take any kind of earthworm and I can throw it in the bin and I'm going to have worm composting. But the truth of the matter is it is a very specialized type of worm. They're known as epigeic worms. These are worms that live very high up in the soil profile. They tend to live in rich organic matter. So these epigeic worms, things like red worms and African night crawlers, there's not that many, but just a small handful of worms that are very specialized. So they love these rich waste. So your kitchen scraps, your manure, these things that normal earthworms aren't generally really specialized for. So they can handle a lot of heat. They can handle these rapidly changing environments, everything that makes them perfect to live in a little bin or in a bed outside. Whereas these soil worms, they like it down in the dirt, down where it's cool and relaxed and there's, not much going on, not crowded. And so it's one of these things. It's an early mistake that a lot of people make. But so it's those worms, the specialized epigeic worms, plus microbes. Everybody forgets the microbes.
Yeah, exactly.
They think of the worms, okay, but it's the microbes. Literally, the microbes do everything. The worms get the lion's share of the glory. And they do have the digestive system, I'll give them that. But the fact is, it's these little microbes in there with all these particles and everything else, and they're doing the magic, essentially.
I was under the impression that the microbes do the breaking down and that the worms actually eat the microbes and the exudates from the microbes. Yeah,
well, that whole thing that's a very complicated side of the whole thing. The research says that earthworms get most of their nutrition from microorganisms, yet it's also microorganisms that do a lot of the work. So there's a little bit of a gray area in there. Which ones are the food that they're getting, and then which ones are the specialized ones in the digestive tract that are literally in there with their enzymes and everything else and breaking it down, adding all the special compounds. So it's very complex. Microbiology in general, I would never, I took microbiology while I was in university, but I wouldn't in a million years claim that I was remotely close to an expert of microbiology. And I don't think there really is anybody who is an expert of composting worm microbiology.
Mm-hmm. how does worm composting and traditional thermophilic composting differ?
Well, the big thing, the one thing I touched on earlier was the beauty of it with the worm composting is the flexibility of scale. So somebody in an apartment, somebody in a condominium, in a house, backyard composter, any of these sorts of small scale types of situations, it can be a perfect option for them. With the thermophilic composting, you really do need that critical mass. You need the full cubic meter or more of mass of materials, and it's got to be balanced pretty well. You have your carbon to nitrogen ratio has to be 25 to 1 or whatever. You have to get it really perfect. You got to get the perfect moisture and aeration, all this sort of stuff. And then that's not even the end of the process. I mean, there's some work involved.
That's just the beginning, right? Exactly.
Yeah, you can't just leave it there. I mean, there's static aeration type of piles where you can set it up so that it's got some good airflow going in naturally, but generally speaking, you're going to need some kind of big tumbler or something that's going to provide that oxygen in there. Whereas with the worms, they're like your little workers. They're in there, they're turning everything, they're mixing the microbes around, they're aerating, they're fragmenting. So they're like your workers. You just throw them in, you let them do their thing. It's not to say you don't provide them with the conditions they need, but they do a lot of the work. So that's kind of the big thing. And then obviously, like what we talked about, just the end product is quite unique in comparison.
Well, and I get this question a lot from people. They ask me, well, can I put worms in my compost bin? And the biggest challenge there is the heat, because a traditional thermophilic composting bin can get up to 160 degrees.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, if you're talking about any sort of large size system or pretty much any outdoor system in Phoenix, for that matter, the heat is such a killer. It's very, very challenging. And that's one of the, I guess if you come up with a limitation for vermicomposting, you are dealing with living animals. And so they really, really need their specific temperature range and everything else. So this stuff that we're certainly going to be talking about, I'm sure, at some point. The in-ground systems, they do help a lot in that regard because you can really, really keep the temperatures down. But yeah, you're right. I mean, anything that's a big, large above-ground system, especially in a hot location, it's going to be, and that's why I would never say, oh, worm composting is better than hot composting. I love partnering different things. There's black soldier fly larvae. They do great in hot weather. Put them up above, get them processing the rich waste, and then get the worms down below. Like get everything working together, or pre-compost in a big hot compost pile, and then put it into a smaller temperature-controlled system with the worms. And I love this sort of connection of different types of systems.
Beautiful. So let's talk about starting a worm bin. It can literally be underneath your desk where you saw it, and It's really super simple. Tell us how we get started.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of overcomplicate it a little bit. They get excited about it, and then they want to rush out and spend a lot of money on one of these sort of commercial bins and all this stuff. Literally, all you need is a Rubbermaid tub. Some air holes would be important. The airflow they do need oxygen. They're aerobic organisms. So some Rubbermaid Roughneck is one of my favorites.
Yep.
Just a tough bin, very, very cheap. Cut some holes in the side and the lid. Bedding is one of these things that I think newcomers they don't use enough of it. Anytime I've looked at a new bin that somebody's just started up, 9 times out of 10, they have mostly kitchen scraps and then almost none of this bedding material. And it's really, really important to put lots and lots of shredded cardboard or shredded newsprint. Those are two very easy ones. Most people have really good access to them. And they help to kind of balance. They provide that habitat value, and they help with the airflow as well. So a bin mostly filled with, say, shredded cardboard or shredded newsprint, moistened, and then a small amount of food scraps. Ideally, if you can let it sit for a period of time, just to let the microbes kind of develop on the food scraps, and that's pretty much it. Yeah. And then you add your culture of worms, or your pack of worms you get from a supplier, and that's basically it.
So, and we're looking specifically, you kind of touched on this earlier, specifically for composting worms. Where does Where does one find composting worms?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, there's lots of suppliers out there. This is something that's certainly grown by leaps and bounds in the past few decades. Red worms are the ones that I recommend far beyond any other. They are very versatile. They're very tolerant of a wide range of conditions. They can tolerate cold and fairly warm conditions. And they're just a mellow worm. It's kind of funny to talk about an earthworm being mellow.
Yeah.
But there's some species out there that, they don't like vibration. They're sensitive worms. They roam, and you don't want to come home to find worms all over your wall. You want them to stay in the bin. And red worms are they're absolutely the easiest ones, and they're probably the most readily available anyway. So you just go on Google, say, composting worms, whatever your area happens to be. It's a pretty good chance you're actually going to find somebody who's literally selling them somewhere close by.
Yeah, I've noticed that in the past 3 or 4 years is that locally here in Phoenix, there's been several worm compost companies that have sprouted up and are, you can buy worms from them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. So you have your bin, and the one that you mentioned, I think, is gray on the bottom, and they have yellow lids. You put some shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard in it, 3 or 4 inches worth?
Yeah. Honestly, I would say just jam the thing full.
6 or 8 inches? Okay, good.
If it's right to the top, what you're going to find is that it settles anyway. So there's almost no such thing as too much bedding, especially when you're first getting started.
Yeah.
Just jam her full. If you can do alternating, it really depends on how long you're going to let it sit.
Yeah.
If you're planning on letting it sit for maybe a week or so, you could literally do alternating layers. You start with a very thick layer of the bedding on the bottom, do a sort of layer of kitchen scraps, another thick layer of bedding, layer of kitchen scraps, all the way up, and end with a bedding layer. And then if you let that sit for a week, maybe moisten it a little bit partway through, just make sure it's nice and evenly moistened.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfect. That'll be in really good shape for the worms.
Awesome. Then you add your pound of worms and let them go at it.
Absolutely.
And within about 3 or 4 months, the newspaper scraps and the food scraps have turned into this nice, rich, dark, healthy worm poop, right?
Oh yeah, and that's you've hit the nail on the head as far as the time, and that's what you have to kind of temper your expectations a little bit. And it's 3 or 4 months for sure, and try to keep them in a climate-controlled location, especially if you live in Phoenix, anywhere around any of those sorts of regions. There's so many areas where if you toss, and it's not even Phoenix for that matter. If I live in Ontario, Canada, and if I tossed a dark plastic bin on my deck in the middle of the summer, it just turns into an oven, that right. Solar radiation and everything else. So if you can keep it indoors, people always worry about the critters and just the problems of the hassles of having it indoors. But if you take a moderated approach and just a relaxed approach with it, don't add too much food. As long as they have the habitat material, they should be fine. It's going to be great. And it shouldn't stink. It should be easy.
Oh, yeah. It does not smell, that's for sure. Well, the bin that I actually built is a flow-through bin. It's 3 foot by 4 foot, and it stands about 4 feet tall. And I use old oven grates at the bottom.
That sounds great.
Yeah, and the bottom is about 2 feet off of the ground, and the bin itself is about 2 feet thick. And so I start once a year. I start cardboard at the bottom, just sheets of cardboard at the bottom. I add some cocoa peat, add some worms, and start throwing food scraps in there. And inside of 12 months, I'll harvest, 30 pounds of worm castings out of there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And have you tried putting in your plants? And
oh, yeah. You bet. That's what it's there for.
Yeah, exactly.
The one thing I have to do here is, now this bin is completely shaded. There is no sun that hits it directly. And I've found that even in the summertime, I have to drop a block of ice on the top of it because it's just too hot here.
That's 100 plus we're talking about, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That's serious heat.
So I freeze a block of ice in the morning after I've dropped the ice on the on the worms. And so I just, this morning I froze tomorrow's block of ice, and it seems to work really well.
Yeah. Do you mind if I jump in here and make one suggestion related to that?
Please, I'm always open.
That's a fantastic idea. One mistake that some people make is they freeze food waste, and instead of the block of ice, they do they toss in a whole bunch of frozen food waste, and that seems good in theory, and probably for the first. I don't know how fast a block of ice melts in Phoenix, but it's probably pretty fast. Once that is melted, and then you got a bunch of food waste in there, it can be real trouble, because it's the decomposition of those waste that can lead to problems, but then even that can cause microbial heating in addition to the ambient heating. And so don't ever do that.
Oh, interesting. Got it.
Block of ice, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome.
As long as it has a sort of drainage, basically.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a flow-through bin. So a flow-through bin is, basically it has an open bottom on it. And, I manage that with cardboard at the bottom. And so the water just flows right through. And
you have a very dry heat there too, don't you?
Oh, yes.
So a nice evaporative cooling, that's another thing that can work really well.
Yeah, you bet. So I don't want to miss this question. You've been playing with something called the trench vermicomposting?
Yes, I have.
Do you want to chat about that now, or do you want to chat about that in your failures?
Well, I mean, we can chat about it a little bit. I mean, maybe just get started.
Perfect.
I'm very excited about vermicomposting trenches. It's very closely related to what we're talking about because of the fact that it's such a fantastic way to moderate some of these climate extremes. So we have different locations where, like Phoenix, where it's extreme heat in, I don't know how much of the year, probably like at least half the year, where you've got some really serious temperatures to contend with. And anything that's kind of sitting up above ground is going to be challenging. So what's amazing is that once you dig down into the earth has this incredible ability to provide cool conditions, essentially. So if you dig a hole, you go down and feel the dirt at the bottom of that hole, you'll see pretty quickly that the temperature down there is quite a bit lower. And they have this geothermal heating and all these things where they're pumping up air from down below. And this is sort of a simple version of that, where you get them down below the ground, and it's not even just heat. So once the cold temperatures arrive in regions like my own, where we have our serious winter every year, it's going to buffer that as well. And so it's I'm sure we'll get into the origin story, the backstory behind that a bit later on, but I can't recommend in-ground system. It's not even just a system itself. Like if you can have a backyard composter, any kind of above-ground system, and then have a bit of a below-ground area, sort of a safe zone, it can make a huge difference in terms of your chances of success with an outdoor system.
Got it. What does your trench vermicomposting system look like?
Well, one of the beautiful things about it is it doesn't have to look like anything in particular. It's any kind of, and I say trench a lot, I use the term trench, but it can be literally any sort of pit or any kind of hole in the ground on the most simple, basic level. Something like a worm tower is basically just a PVC pipe that goes, or a bucket is even better. Something a little bit bigger than a PVC pipe that is buried in the ground. So you dig just a very, very simple pit, bury this bucket with holes in it in the ground, and treat it like a worm bin. You put your bedding and your food scraps inside the bin, ideally somewhere close to where plants are growing. And that's sort of the most basic level type of in-ground system. It can go all the way up to, I have all kinds of different trenches that run alongside my gardens. I have now this big, massive system that is a trench with what's known as a walking windrow kind of set up down in it. And it's just so much value when it comes to buffering those climate extremes when you set any kind of system down in the ground somewhat.
Got it. Well, and then you're getting an interaction between the soil because you put holes in the side of it, right?
Yeah. Now, in the case of the tower, that's literally a physical structure. And in some cases where you live in a region where there might be a lot of moles or something where if you're a bit worried about anything coming in, roots, for example, you may want to put some kind of literal physical wall or bucket or an actual container. You could probably literally submerge a worm bin down on the ground and have it be quite a bit cooler than if a bin that was sort of sitting above ground.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely the case.
But it doesn't actually have to have any kind of a structure.
Interesting. So I know that your vermi trenching project is your failure. So let's jump over there and do that. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed and how you overcame the failure and what you might have learned from it.
All right. Well, back in the spring of 2008, I contacted this incredibly popular restaurant, probably the most popular restaurant in our region. They have big buffets. People drive for miles to come to this restaurant. And I had in my head that I was going to take all of their compostable kitchen scraps and I was going to compost them on my suburban property. So I probably had about 3 backyard composters, maybe another bin outside. And I just, whatever. I was excited. I thought this sounded like a great initiative. I was gonna, whatever. I was gonna make it work.
Right.
It didn't take long to realize that I was in way over my head. I quickly realized this was hundreds and hundreds of pounds of kitchen scraps. They were compostable at least, but broccoli and all of these peelings and everything else that this place was using every single day, hundreds of pounds. Just the logistics of driving over there, having these bins, getting it back to my little property, and then needless to say, these systems in my yard, they started filling up very, very fast.
Yeah.
And I like to think I know what I'm doing, so I had them all layered properly. And I wasn't even thinking of worm composting at this point. I just trying to do something that would provide some aeration and thermophilic composting. And those bins, they filled up very, very quickly. And the stage 2 was squirrel mode. I basically went around my yard and dug these little holes and I buried it. And so it was just everywhere. I was digging holes all over my yard, dumping this stuff in. And it's actually worked quite well. Once it's in the ground, it doesn't smell, doesn't cause problems. And surprisingly enough, there weren't any animal issues. But eventually, I came to the point where I ran out of places to dig these little holes. So it was starting to get a little bit nerve-wracking. And I had these plastic bins. This was summertime by this point. Plastic bins, organic waste, sitting on my driveway, in my shed, all over my yard. And it started to smell really, really bad. Stepping out into my backyard, you'd literally hit with a wall of stench. It was very scary, to be honest. And I was terrified. I didn't know what I was going to do. And suddenly I sort of thought, okay, well, you've been digging these little tiny holes. What about if you just dug this monstrous, gigantic hole, this big, huge trench in beside your garden, just something huge, you can get rid of all this stuff. And I happened to have a lot of cardboard and paper at the time. And I thought, maybe I'll at least try to do some kind of composting thing with it. And so I started layering the cardboard and just dumping this nasty sludge in. It took the whole thing. It did everything. I was able to fill it with all the waste materials, all this bedding material that I had, and covered it up. And that alone was like a miracle. I was like,
right.
Wow. I literally got rid of all this horrible stuff, and nobody called the authorities, amazingly enough.
I'm over here. I'm going to pause you for a minute here. I'm over here laughing because I've done the same thing over the past year and a half. I've been collecting 10 bucket loads of food waste from a restaurant for the past year and a half.
That's awesome.
And, I was doing black soldier flies. I've got my worms. I've got the chickens, and I've got my traditional composting system. And just over the past few months, so it took about a year and a half, but finally everything filled up. It's like, all right, I can't do this anymore. So currently, I have about 25 bins sitting back in my compost area that have food waste in them that have been there for a month. And I can't even imagine. I opened one of them this morning and it was like, oh, stomach turning. So my job tomorrow morning, right? My job tomorrow morning is to build a traditional thermophilic compost system and use all of that with it. So I feel your pain.
Yeah. Now the one positive in your area is those black soldier flies.
Oh yes,
they can handle just the nastiest of horrible stuff. They'll eat meat and everything rotting. So I think they'll help you out anyway.
Oh yeah.
Once you get something set up, but yeah, it's ugly.
So your success then, I can tell from our conversation that your failure is turning into a success. Tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I got this trench set up. I at that point was literally just survival mode. You just get rid of this waste, probably cancel this whole thing, not get in trouble, not get arrested. And first of all, it took all those bins. I couldn't believe the amount of material that I was able to get into this trench. It was a pretty good sized trench, don't get me wrong, but all this material, all this bedding, and then it didn't stink. There was no smell. So, me being me, Mr. Dummy here, I'm like, okay, well, this almost seems like it's working again. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I can actually make this work. So I started extending the trenches. I started digging them in other parts of the yard. And it was fantastic. It was clearly able to handle those wastes early on. And the big thing, I mean, that was sort of the first level of awesome, essentially. But the big thing that came later on was the impact that these trenches had on my garden. I hadn't really thought about that at the time. But they're sitting there, and I did add worms. I added them at the top, and I thought, okay, well, let's see what they can do in there. So they thrived, and the population took off. And this was like no garden I had ever had in my life. I was sort of the mediocre garden guy, not really a green thumb yet at that point. And suddenly I felt like, I don't know, green thumb pro. Basically nothing. These plants were like Jurassic Eenies and everything else. And that was the big clincher. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not going to claim that I was able to do this forever. I do live in southern Ontario. So once those cool temps started to come in the fall, I knew that everything slows down. It slows down the composting process a lot. And so I did, realistically, I knew I was going to have to, and I was just worn out, lugging all that hundreds of pounds of waste every week and everything else. I decided to end it, but it was a major turning point for me. And it completely changed my perspective on vermicomposting and gardening. It was just a very, very important stage for me to go through that.
Nice. And what drives you?
Early on, I would say, I think I sort of alluded to early on, just this curiosity. I had this fascination with nature all my life. Any natural history of critters, essentially, any organisms. My dad kind of got me out in the forest, turning over logs and gardening from an early age. And so I've always had this fascination. And just like I said, seeing this process and seeing what these worms could do, that was 100% my early driving force. But then, I knew that this is a process that more people should know about.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people that know about it, but this is almost magical to me. And so I really wanted to share it with others. And I'll be honest, I probably sound kind of loud and talkative by this point, but I'm pretty introverted and shy in the real world. I'm not out there giving speeches and all this sort of stuff. And so I thought, well, what if you set up a website and just kind of tell people what you're doing and share your quirky little adventures with this stuff and see what can happen from that. And so that kind of led to part two of the motivation, which was just seeing this connection with all these people, I was amazed. The internet is amazing.
Oh, yeah.
The quirkiest of weird obsessions, and you can find thousands upon thousands of people who are actually interested in it. And so just, building a following and making this impact apparently on people and having this positive feedback. I joke with my followers that the positive feedback is like rocket fuel. It's essentially, this idea, I touched you in some little way, you inspired you to get involved and you're trying it out. And I love that. And, I guess the enthusiasm kind of helps. And so that's sort of the big motivation now, is just seeing that, this can really make a difference, and especially with an online platform. And so, that's, big time what motivates me now. But of course, the magic of the process itself is at the heart of it.
Nice. And if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
Well, I would say, I know that you have a mixed crowd. You have some people who would probably be interested in gardening and worm composting on a small scale, but also some homesteaders and some that might have a bit of a entrepreneurial leaning. So I would probably have two recommendations, if that's all right.
Please.
Number one, the basic home vermicomposter book would definitely be Worms Eat My Garbage by Mary Applehoff. And she is a true pioneer of worm composting. She's somebody who back in the 80s was showing people that they could take their kitchen scraps and they can turn it into this amazing black gold before anybody else was really doing that. We had these worm farmers from the 70s who were raising bait worms, and there's actually a lot of scams back then, a lot of dark sort of days associated with the worm farming industry. And she came along and she'd show people it's not just about that. It's about really, really taking these waste materials and making something amazing. So she unfortunately, she passed away in 2005, but the work that she did for the home vermicomposting crowd and just in general, it's just amazing.
So before you go any farther, I know that Story Publishing has republished her book, and with the help of Joanne Olszewski, I think, Olszewski, they have put out the 35th anniversary of Worms Eat My Garbage. So it's available, and we'll have this on our show notes page as well. But they did a really good job of updating the book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Her work was so important. And there's just been a sort of a, legacy and people carrying on her work, which is awesome.
And the second book.
Yes, the second book, for those of you who are sort of thinking, maybe this would be a fun business to start, and I can tell you for sure that it is a great little idea for something if you want to start a side business. Probably won't get too in-depth in that, but the Worm Farmer's Handbook by Rhonda Sherman. And Rhonda's another person who has been around for ages. She was one of the original all-stars when I was first learning about vermicomposting. I mean, she was among this group of people, included Mary Applehoff, of people who were really, really making great strides to promoting this quirky hobby, essentially. And she's just stuck with it. She's at North Carolina State University, and every year she hosts a big worm farming conference. And so she recently released the Worm Farmer's Handbook. Excellent book if you want to learn about just kind of the business side of things.
Perfect. So that was Rhonda Sherman, right?
Absolutely.
We actually had her on the podcast, episode 405.
Oh, oh wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So, and that was an incredible episode. So if you just go to urbanfarm.org, top right, you can type in Rhonda Sherman and she will come up. So you can visit with Rhonda as well.
Awesome.
What one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
The big thing, a lot of people kind of jump in. They want to dive in and go crazy with it. And they start to think of their worms as their pets, and they have to feed them lots and lots of food every day and all this sort of thing. And the big mistake is there's all these pieces of wisdom floating around from years past about how to worm compost. There's these rules of thumb. A worm can eat double its weight every day in food waste, all these sorts of ideas. And it gives people the wrong impression of how worm composting works. They get in their head that they can start this Rubbermaid tub, put all of their food scraps in it, and these worms are going to miraculously convert it into black gold with no problem. That's definitely not the way to do it. You really want to emphasize the habitat, the quality bedding that we talked about, all that shredding cardboard, the newsprint. Focus on the habitat. Don't worry so much about the food. These worms are incredibly difficult to starve. They are very easy to overfeed. And overfeeding is, hands down, I'm sure, the most common problem with any new vermicomposter. They want to keep adding food day after day. I should be able to add a pound. I have a pound of worms, so I should be able to add a pound of food every day. And these crazy ideas, what you want to do is treat it more as a fun experiment. You get them set up with a little tiny bit of food, with their bedding. Watch what they do. Observe them. See, are they eating the food? Are they processing it? If it looks like they're really doing well with it, sure, add another scrap, whatever. You don't need to go too crazy with adding all kinds of food scraps. And just, keep it simple in general. You don't have to spend hundreds of dollars to get started. Basic Rubbermaid tub. Yeah, away you go. Have fun with it.
Some shredded newspapers and a half pound of worms.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Bentley.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
redwormcomposting.com. That's my main stomping grounds, and that's probably a good place to send people. And from there, there's all kinds of ways to connect with me elsewhere, but yeah, redwormcomposting.com, perfect.
Excellent. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/Compost Guy. We are your urban farming resource. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and everywhere podcasts are found. Also visit urbanfarm.org to find articles, webinars, courses, and more. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.